Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Alexandra. I'm the director here at Cultural Affairs here at WNMU. Thank you for coming to the New Mexico Artist Workshop series, Journey of the Storyteller. I wanted to thank a few people. I want to thank Jennifer Douglas for curating this series. It is one in a series, and it will continue, so look out for more. I want to thank Maida Branch, who is Johnny Ortiz's partner in the SHED project, for being here with us. And I would like to thank our sponsors, WIL, Western Institute for Lifelong Learning, the National Endowment for the Arts, and New Mexico Arts, which makes a lot of this programming possible. And without further ado, thank you for coming. And Johnny, take it away.
Well, thank you all for being here. I don't know if my microphone's on yet. Can you guys hear me? Cool. We kind of talked about a lot of this earlier today, so if you were there, sorry to repeat myself, but super happy to be up here with all of you guys. What we do in SHED Project, kind of in our homeland up north, is really special to us, and it's nice to spread that down to southern New Mexico, so thanks again for being here. I wanted to talk a little bit about who I am and where I'm from and how I've come to starting SHED Project and what that is. But I was born and raised in Taos, New Mexico. My mother's side of the family's Spanish origin, so mother Spain and all the people that they brought over on their journey here. There was like Jewish people and all kinds of other things. So when you say Spanish, it means Spanish speaking, but really who knows what that actually means. My father's side is from Taos Pueblo there, so Native American, and that's where I spent most of my childhood. I grew up in my great-grandfather's house, which was an old adobe structure that he had built with a mud roof. I remember like grasses and cactuses growing off the roof, and when it would rain, we'd put buckets under it to catch all that water. My parents were both really young when they had me. My mom was 16, my dad was 17, and so I grew up kind of a little bit on the side of poverty. We went to my grandma's house every Sunday, and she had beans and chili. And so we had a really close family. Grew up eating a lot of pretty generic 90s foods, as I'm sure a lot of you have. Lunchables and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and that kind of stuff. And I don't think I really actually realized where food came from. And I was, like I said, super picky eater for a very long time. But growing up in this place, I don't think I quite realized it while I was there. Everyone growing up was always eager to leave. They would talk about like, when I leave, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to leave then. And it's kind of sad because the place is so special. If you're unfamiliar with Taos Pueblo, it's the longest inhabited reservation or village in the whole entire country. I think there's one in Hawaii that is kind of in par with it, but what that means is that it has never been relocated by anyone else. So, you know, like the U.S. government moved the Navajos to a certain location, and then it became a reservation. Taos Pueblo had been inhabiting that land for thousands of years, and instead of fighting the Spanish and having them push them somewhere else, they just kind of gave in to Spanish rule, took on Catholicism, and kept their homeland. So it was super beautiful to grow up in a place where there's this rich culture and beauty around me at all times. The other side of that coin is that a lot of that history had been erased. And so while being immersed in this beautiful culture, there was a lot of poverty and a lot of alcoholism. My grandfather passed away when he was, I think, like 52, so pretty young. So this is my great-grandfather, Lupe Concha from the Pueblo. And then this is the village of the Pueblo in, I think, the early 1920s. Lupe Concha was the last sort of guy on the Pueblo to raise cattle for a long time. I think there's a couple families who raise cattle now, and the village itself raises bison, so that's kind of making a little bit of a comeback. But, you know, I didn't spend a whole lot of time with Lupe. He gave me my Indian name, which is Ku'alumei, and very few memories of him, but if I look back on my sort of upbringing and who I am today, a lot of it's attributed to him, and I feel super grateful to call him my grandfather. So the catalyst for me in sort of my journey with food was, it's kind of a vague memory, but I remember walking down the road from my grandfather's house to the village that you saw in the last picture. It's one dirt road. It connects straight to the village in like a 2-minute walk. And my mother showed me that Lupe would eat the rose petals from the wild roses that were there. And so as a kid, I was like eating these rose petals and sharing them with all my friends. Everyone thought it was crazy. And then I didn't really look back on that moment for a long time, but looking back on that, I realized I don't think I even knew what food was or where it came from. And kind of this moment was like an epiphany that food actually came from a plant or like from nature. And so that was a really big moment for me. And we still use wild roses in everything that we do now. So I spent this whole journey, and I'll get into that a little bit, about leaving home and coming back. But I started this project called Shed. And Shed, the definition of shed: to set apart, to resist being affected by, to cast off or let fall off by a natural process, to promote new growth. And so I kind of wanted this to be my sort of like ethos of my project and what I do. And I was enamored by the fact that when a snake sheds its skin, it becomes more of itself rather than less of itself. And so I kind of wanted to embody that in everything that I do. These are our beautiful burros and landrace trail sheep that we got from Jennifer. So then the ethos of Shed, this is kind of something that I compiled early on in starting Shed, but Shed is really an ongoing meditation on where we live and are from in northern New Mexico, a celebration of its terrain and fleeting of time, an ecosystem of practices that revolve around small-scale intimate dinners that are the fruiting body to the processes practiced that reflect in each of their facets a story of the place we inhabit and those who come before, carrying on the tradition of bringing people together through food, a blurring of lines between life and work. And so this table here is the table that we serve all the food on, and they're these beautiful 12 people dinners. Everyone sits at the same table together and shares food together. And you know, when I first started this, I didn't realize that I was going to be doing anything more than cooking. I thought cooking was just a means of serving people food, and I loved being creative with it. But as we kind of started going on and on, realized that there's no better way to bring people together than food. Everyone eats food and loves food, and when you get people together in that way, some sort of magic happens. And so I was one of the kids that said I'm always going to leave, and I did. I was 19 years old. New Mexico has a really great lottery scholarship, so I had the opportunity to go to UNM. I figured I'd go to school for business, and I would learn how to cook on the side. And so I did that first semester. I had a chef that I worked for who sat me down one day and said, "What do you want to do with your life?" And I was like, "I don't know. I think I'm going to go to business school. I'm going to work in a restaurant on the side." And he was like, "Fuck that. Like, if you want to learn how to cook, you're not going to learn that from a place in New Mexico. Like, go live in a city and either go to school out there or work in a restaurant." And so I did that. Probably not good to say that at a university, but I'm just not someone who's very enamored by, you know, traditional schooling systems. But you know, I worked in this restaurant for a year and a half. I didn't know it at the time exactly, but it was going to be named just weeks after I started working there the best restaurant in the country by the San Pellegrino World's Best Restaurant list. They received 3 Michelin stars, which is kind of like the highest accolade you can get as a restaurant. And so there was like 40, 50 cooks every night, and it was a pretty cutthroat environment. It kind of felt like the military or some sort of intense brotherhood, maybe like what an NFL player feels like or something. And I was 19 years old, had no idea what I was doing, but they really took me in and really showed me the ropes and let me kind of be excited and not know what I was doing. My mom had bought me a Rachel Ray knife from Ross. Actually, it was probably like a $10 knife, and it was this like bright orange color, and I showed up to like the best restaurant in the country, and luckily no one said anything about it, but one day the chef came over, threw it in the trash, and gave me a new knife, and I was really grateful for that. I kind of wish I had the knife still though, but, and then I kind of really wanted to, I'm a competitive person by nature, and I really kind of want to push myself to my limits, and so I kind of imagined that I would work my way up into this restaurant and have a bigger role in the place, and also realized I was young and that I had no idea how to cook, and this place, even though it was the best restaurant, really didn't cook anything. It was all gels and mixing of different like food chemicals they had like an edible balloon that you would like suck the helium out and then eat the balloon afterwards, and it was a pretty wild spot, but I wanted to learn how to cook more, so I decided to move to Washington State, where there was a restaurant there called the Willows Inn, and it was run by the chef Blaine Wetzel. He had only been there for a year or two, and was starting to fix up this old resort that had been there since, I think, 1912. And they had a farm, they had chickens, they had a boat that did reef net fishing, so we'd get really beautiful Soho salmon from the bay there. We'd go down and collect seaweeds and cook on fire, and it was a really great sort of introduction for me to like start learning about cooking again. But being kind of like a younger restaurant, the level of sort of like dedication or sense of urgency that the restaurant in Chicago had was missing from this place. So I was kind of craving a city again, and then decided to move to San Francisco. While I was in Chicago, a chef there had mentioned to me this restaurant or a pop-up called Saison in San Francisco, and I'd been sending him emails and never heard back from anyone. And then finally, when I decided, you know, I'm just gonna move to San Francisco, if I get a job there, that'd be great, or maybe I'll find somewhere else, I sent him an email again, and they got back to me and were like, hey, we're opening our restaurant, come over on Monday and you'll have an interview and a trial. So I packed up my car and I drove all the way down from Seattle to San Francisco and had the meeting that same morning, or the morning after, and got the job there as the meat cook on the fire station. And so this was kind of like my dream come true, everything I had wanted at Alinea, the first place, and had been working towards at the second place, I kind of had the opportunity to be part of. And so by being there, I was like going to school and living my best dream. After a year, I was promoted to sous chef, so I got to kind of run the restaurant and work directly under the chef owner, and kind of like make this place super special. This next year, we won the 3 Michelin stars. I think we got 16 on that same best restaurant list. So it was pretty awesome to be part of that, but also to know that part of that was from my efforts. And so I stayed there for a while. The chef ended up selling the restaurant, when we're still friends to this day. But I could kind of feel, sorry about that. I could kind of feel that he was kind of moving out of the restaurant and was about to sell it. I didn't really know that, but I could feel it in my heart. And so I decided to leave and start my own project, which is Shed. And generally, the reason for starting Shed was kind of just becoming disenamored with the whole restaurant world in general. A lot of times you hear words like farm to table, but the restaurant might not even have, like, organic milk is a good example. And so I was over all the sort of theatrics and the like false promises that restaurants held, and they were intimate but not so intimate. And so I wanted to create something that was fully intimate and fully authentic and fully of my own creation. And so I started taking ceramic lessons in San Francisco. I started foraging from different farms and throughout the bay, and so decided to start Shed. And I started it in Mill Valley out of my 1-bedroom apartment, something that I kind of always wanted to do, and now kind of sounds kind of janky, but it was a lot of fun. And the kitchen was like a tiny counter with a sink, and I'd cook all the food, and then guests were showing up, so I'd put like a piece of wood over the sink, and I'd do all my plating and stuff there, and then I'd hide all the dishes in the bathroom. I had a big shelf in the bathroom, so I'd do dishes after everyone left. It was pretty nuts, but I did that for a few months, and it was such a great start to kind of getting on my own feet and kind of exploring that for myself. But then shortly realized shortly after that moving back home was kind of the next step in this evolution. And so a few months later, I packed everything up and moved back home. Yeah, and so I started that in Taos as a semi-nomadic project. So instead of being a restaurant where you're open 5 days a week and you have to follow these guidelines and stuff, I kind of wanted to create a different model, something that hadn't been done before. And so instead of making pop-ups where we'll do a dinner at a certain spot, we kind of wanted to have kind of the mix between the two. And so we started calling it a dinner series. So we do different series in different spots that were all kind of attached to their location. So at the chocolate shop, we'd use a lot of cocoa beans and a lot of the stuff that they use there. We did one at a wood shop, and that was during the winter. So we'd use a lot of wood in our food, like ponderosa bark and needles and pine tips and saps and all that stuff. And so it really felt like each series was unique, and it wasn't just like us popping up in a spot. And so that was a lot of fun. But as we started to evolve a little bit more, kind of realized that we wanted to, grow our own food and serve our own stuff. So I'd finally found some land that I kind of wanted to start working with, and something that I wanted to spend the rest of my life on. So bought that, started growing some crops, got some sheep from Jennifer, and then I met Maida, and we bought a house together and bought a second piece of land. And to this day, we have the first land, the second land, and the house. We're fixing up a house in one of the fields to do our dinners in the future. But we have land-raised churro sheep. We have land-raised Creole cattle, all kinds of beautiful stuff, and I'll get into some of that, I guess. So the project that I started kind of was this thing. I just wanted to be creative with food and figure out how to do that. And after doing that for some time, kind of realized that what I actually wanted to create was much larger than that and more of an ecosystem. So the way we look at it now is more of an ecosystem where the fruiting body of everything we do becomes the dinners. So, we don't necessarily you don't get to necessarily be part of the process of us, say, moving sheep or shearing the sheep or spinning the wool or dyeing the wool or weaving it. But you might have the weaving at the dinners. It might be a throw to keep you warm. And so that way, the dinners are like the perfect showcase for everything we do. So dinners is the fruiting body of all of the efforts. But the train and participation is one, and I'll go into these more on the next slides. Ecology and connection, land and animal husbandry, remedios, foraging, clays, the vessels, generating culture and education, mercado, making, and recuerdos, remembering. I kind of mentioned that the dinners are the fruiting body, but they're also sort of a way to help us keep the tempo of the seasons. As you all know, New Mexico, at least northern New Mexico a little bit more too, has all 4 seasons and very distinctly. And so it gives us time to have different sort of practices throughout the year. So like generally during the winter, I do all my clay all my clay work. In the spring we harvest the clay and then we process it and save it for the winter. But in the spring and summer we're doing foraging and gardening, and then the fall we're getting firewood and moving cattle. So the dinners are actually a really beautiful way of kind of cataloging the seasons and the tempo of them on the plate. So everything that we use is very of the land, whether it's foraged in the area near us or raised by us. So the cattle and the sheep, whether it's hunted, we use elk and deer, wild trout. We also try to make our own beverages. So we do, every year we get apples from different places. Last year were these really beautiful old growth red delicious apples from Chimayo. So that was the year before. Then this last year we harvested a bunch from Tesuke Village, which are supposedly the oldest orchard in the valley, and the trees are like pretty massive and old and have no varieties to them. They're just kind of old landrace apples. So we pick those and we make our own cider. We pick wild hops and make beer. So this is something that you actually couldn't do in a restaurant. The creating of a new model that we did earlier kind of helped out in this in a way that we could actually say that this is an event or something else, So everyone who comes is a private person. It's not a public business. And so we're able to serve wild meat. We're able to serve raw milk from our cows. We're able to kind of do whatever we want to, which is really beautiful. But the dinners, like I mentioned, are 12 people at the table. And it's so amazing what food can do and how it can bring people together. And I'm blown away by it every time. So this is kind of on the right is a picture of the space that we're inhabiting currently. It's called the Martinez Hacienda, and it's the oldest residential building in all of Taos aside from the Pueblo. And it's this beautiful old territorial building where there's 2 courtyards. The entire building has rooms on the outside of it. So there was the blacksmithing room, the weaving room, the sala where they would have dances and dinners. There was the cellar where they would keep all their meat and produce. There was the kitchen, and then the 2 center courtyards. The first one in the front was kind of just for entertaining guests and hanging out in, but the back one they would bring all the sheep in at night. So sorry about that. The door in the back, there'd be like a slave or a servant or the person taking care of the animals would live back there, and every night they would open the gate, bring the sheep in, and the sheep would live inside of this courtyard. Something that we don't really do anymore, and such a beautiful space. So we have taken over the sala, the space for where they would do dinners and dances, and we're so lucky to be there. On the left is a picture of the menus that we serve. Usually we dye the paper with different plants that we use for the dinners. So this paper was dyed with kota, or green thread. It's a sort of flower that grows in the summer that we use for tea at the end of every dinner. And during the summer, when the plant's still growing, we'll harvest as much of it as we can, set aside some for tea, and then we'll make these little bundles that we'll give away with the menu so that people can go home and they can make a glass of tea at some point or kind of just have it as a memory. But it's pretty awesome to be having a practice where the food is one thing, but that can also be reflected in an object like the menu or an object of a take-home tea that can be used to consume or used as an object. So terrain participation. This one kind of is a big one for me. Being from the Pueblo, there's a lot of sort of ceremonies, a lot of traditional doings. If you've ever heard of like San Geronimo Day, where they climb the pole, or May 3rd, they do these beautiful foot races. The 2 kivas, the south side and north side, race against each other, and it's a relay race. And so each kiva will have the same amount of people, and they'll start off at the same time, and they race like a relay race. And kind of the concept is to give energy to the sun and the moon to like, as we enter spring, and kind of there's another social layer too, where all the women stand on the village and watch all the young men running, and it's kind of like a courting thing too, like you get to see who the strong men are, but it's a beautiful practice, and I never really got to participate in those. My father kind of disconnected from the Pueblo when he was a little younger, even though we were living there, and so I was always a participant, but in the way of witnessing these things, and I didn't think about it too much for a while, but I invited a friend to come watch with me one time, and she was like, well, I don't really want to be a spectator. I don't think I should go. And so I asked my stepfather, who was there from the Pueblo, I was like, Dom, what do you think about, Andrea coming to be a spectator? And he was saying, these ceremonies, they're for fun, and they're social, and they're prayers to the sun and the moon, but they're also prayers for the whole world. We're not just praying for ourselves. And so without witnesses or spectators, who's going to carry it into the world? And, I think of Shed and what we do is a little bit of that, a little bit of a ceremony and prayer. And, by being at the table and participating in that, you kind of carry that prayer out into the world. And so that participation for us is tied into our terrain and everything that we do. So, if we sort of plowed our field too much to get extra hay for a couple of years, 10 years we wouldn't have as good of hay. So when you start to participate with your terrain and Mother Earth, you kind of get to reap the benefits of that and have a more beautiful space. So this is Maida and our dogs moving some of our cows. And that's me chopping wood in the snow. This sort of like kind of life, you know, it's a little bit of a romantic life. We tell people we live on a farm and a ranch and we have 7 dogs and cows and sheep, and everyone's like, oh, that's so nice. Like, I wish I had a life like that. But then there's days when the cows get out at 8 in the morning and it's 0 degrees out and we got to push them back in and fix fences. And or if I'm firing ceramics and it's snowing out, we don't really get to sort of have like a comfortable life all the time, but the life that we do have is endlessly rewarded by being so connected with the land and the creatures. Oops. So ecology, you know, it's something that gets talked about a lot, but for me, it's the connection of living things and their terrain. I'm just going to read this one actually. We tend to forget that we are not separate from, but rather nature ourselves. The sinew of everything shed is trying to do is strengthen those connections to ourselves and those around us. Each facet of shed is tied to our terrain and the culture created by those living within it. Each facet becomes a way to tell a story, from cows to sheep to the food that we cook. And so, you know, in our process, everything that we do, we try and get really sort of intentional about what that is. So like the sheep that we raise, that we got from Jennifer, are these beautiful land-raised churro sheep that kind of have been eradicated throughout history by different groups of people, usually trying to control another type of person. But these sheep the reason that they're land-raised is because they've adapted to this terrain for such a long period of time. Maida and I joke that we're land-raised because we've been from New Mexico for so long. So, you know, these sheep not only like are beautiful because the way they look, but they're beautiful because the way that they interact with the land that they're on because they've been here so long. But they also tell a story of where we're from. And so at dinners, if we're serving churro lamb, we can kind of talk about that story and share that with people. And so every little thing we try and do, from the cows to the sheep to the clay to the dyes to the beverages, everything tells a story of where we're from. These are they're black and white, so you can't really tell how green it is, but we're in the high desert, so about 8,000 feet elevation. And now that it's winter, everything's dry and brown and looks pretty desolate. But in the spring and summer, these pastures that have been flood irrigated for such a long time are super lush, and the grass will be up to my chest. You can hardly walk through it, and this is the grass that we harvest for all our animals. On the right, you can see it's not really just grass. There's a lot of clover, a lot of flax, different types of grass. The rose bushes kind of grow in there sometimes, and so we're able to graze our animals in sort of the most sort of like nurturing pastures that we possibly could, which then in turn goes into the food that we cook for people and the food that we eat ourselves. But it really takes sort of like an intentional participation. There's a few fields near us where they end up just plowing the field and bringing in a tractor and like leveling it all and planting new grass, so they get a higher yield in the same grass. But we kind of forget that diversity is a really, really important thing. So I've kind of talked about this a little bit, but the land and animal husbandry part is really important to us. I don't think there's layers to it, I guess, because when I was talking about the rose petals, I didn't necessarily realize that food came off of the earth. I just thought it was something that was made somewhere, which is kind of how it was for me, actually. But kind of the same with animals and cooking and eating, and you kind of start to forget that, you know, food is supposed to nurture us and energize us, and most restaurants, that's just not possible. You know, you're serving 100+ people a night, you have to order in, you know, once a week, you store that in the fridge. All life and energy that's in that is, for the most part, kind of gone. There's still some semblance of that, but I realized that if I wanted to be a better cook, like, it wasn't about technique, it wasn't about like fancy creativity or whatever it was actually like having the best materials at my at my fingertips, and that meant that we kind of had to raise those ourselves or know someone who did. And I like to think of maybe like that rose petal. If you were to pick that off the bush and put it in your mouth, the flavor is so much more intense than if you pick that, put it in a bag, took it home, put it in the fridge, and then ate it like a week later. So everything we do is very connected to the land and to the animals. And if there's no rose petals, then we don't use rose petals in the dinner. It's kind of a harder way to cook, but everything tastes better. So these animals, obviously there's food, but we love the fact that, in nature, nothing's ever sort of one direction. Everything has multitudes to it, and I like to think of like an apple tree. When there's a bunch of apples that fall off and don't get used, it's not that like they're going to waste. It's feeding the soil, it's feeding the birds, it's feeding the worms. But the animals also have this diversity to them. Our sheep have a really beautiful fleece. The land-raised churros specifically have a really nice primitive fiber, which makes it more insulating and more waterproof. So we love to do stuff with that. So I hand shear all the sheep every year, and Maida dyes the wool with endemic plants that we use in the dinners, and then we have that woven by someone who is pretty close to us, an older Spanish woman, Susie Garcia. That's amazing. And then we're able to offer some of these things that we make to the world. We're kind of new to the cow world, so we're gonna process one soon and tan the hide and do some stuff with the leather. But it's beautiful when you have these animals. You get so much from them. You get the meat, the wool or the hide, but then you also get the sort of engagement with the landscape. We don't do a lot of like composting because we don't really have a lot of waste in what we do. We don't buy a box of kale and then let it sit and then need to get rid of it. We kind of, everything we have, we pick when we need it and we preserve it or we use it. And so we don't really have a lot of compost, but what is good for the soil is having land or animals on it. And I think more than just the manure, I think the earth has these like sensors in it that if it's not being used, kind of doesn't activate as much. So I think every time the animal kind of sets its hooves into the ground, kind of sends a signal to the earth that it's being used. And so we love to have this engagement with the animals and the land, and everything's better for it. That's our dairy cow, Dolores. She's the best. The land that we bought is pretty amazing, and I really couldn't ask for anything better. It's the cornerstone of the village that we live in, so it's an old mercantile. It's about 70 by 40 feet, so quite a big space. Underneath is a really beautiful root cellar. Back 100 years ago, everyone had a root cellar because they didn't have fridges, so they would store stuff in there. So for us, we store our cider we make in there, the beer. We have some deer legs hanging in there right now. And the more that we start to produce, we'll store more stuff in there. We have corn. But the property also came with a pasture, a house that we're fixing up for dinners, but it also came with this milking barn and a tool shed and a corral. So this is where we corral the cows and where we milk Dolores. And this is a nice example of the pastures that we harvest for the animals. I really think, just like humans, we don't really want to be eating, corn every day, and especially corn that's grazed in sort of monocrops. So I think diversity is a big thing for us. We like to think of a diversity of environments that we participate in and a diversity of foods that we eat. And so why not do that with our animals too? So these fields, I don't think I mentioned, are irrigated by our acequia system. And if you're unfamiliar with an acequia, it's a pretty ancient sort of practice of diverting river water from the top sort of elevation and then bringing it downhill and then flooding all these fields. I don't think that anyone would be, or the U.S. government would be happy with us making these systems today, but because they're so old, they're grandfathered in and we get to use them. When we get our water the first and second time of the year, we get like over 100 gallons per minute to flood our field, and we do that for 2 days straight. So the field gets a lot of water. Whatever doesn't soak in goes back to the river. So we're able to water our fields really, really beautifully, and On top of that, also, we get to interact with that sort of process. Like instead of just turning on a hose to water our fields or something, we have to go and open the presa and then let the water into our linderos, which then we kind of, with a shovel for 2 days straight, we kind of go outside and move the dirt around and make sure that the water's hitting everything. And that can be kind of frustrating sometimes because you can't get all the spots soaked, but it's such a beautiful practice. And another part of that is the community aspect of it. Everyone on the acequia who uses it kind of has the same responsibility as each other. And if one person isn't assuming their responsibility and their ditch is dirty, then everyone feels the effect of that. So as a community, it's pretty supportive, but it's also pretty quick to tell you when you're not doing the right thing. So it's cool to see a community actually working in a functional way without like a outside government or system to tell them what to do. We all need the water and want it, and so we all keep each other in check. Remedios in northern New Mexico is kind of a general term for medicinal plants. And back in the day, every little village had a curandera that would come and be able to heal you with remedios and make all these tinctures and remedies. Something that's kind of really lost nowadays. For me, remedios is a little bit more of just kind of healthy foods in a way of thinking of it. At the Pueblo, even though it's such an old culture, the food culture has totally been eradicated. First by the Spanish rule and then by the U.S. government. Traditional foods now are like white flour, white sugar, all the stuff that's not really great for you, especially if you're eating that all the time. And so the only time they cook really traditionally is when a boy is in the kiva and the grandmother's cooking his food. He's not allowed to have any food from outside the Pueblo, so she goes and picks the plums for his desserts, and she grows the corn. And so that's the only time that there's really, for me, it feels like a really traditional food system. But even at that, they kind of cheat. They'll go to they're like, oh, okay, we'll go to Sid's and buy turkey eggs because that's a traditional food. But they're not practicing that sort of lifestyle anymore. And so for me, remedios and wild foods, whether it be animals or plants, kind of becomes this connection with this past that I don't have access to or don't have connection to, in a way that this is what my ancestors would have eaten because they were on the same terrain. And they wouldn't have been able to go to the grocery store. So this is what they would have eaten. And really for me, it's that connection. And also the thought that some food is medicinal and some food is just food is kind of funny to me. Like, I think, food and medicine is the same thing, and so we kind of treat it that same way. These are the wild plums that grow on the Pueblo. One of my favorite sort of things to use. We make these little, in Tiwa they're called yujuhus, but they're little sweet tamales that we make with blue corn from our farm with cedar ash and grass-fed butter. And then on the inside, we make a paste of these wild plums or pululus and osha root or bear root, which is a really beautiful medicinal herb grows in the high mountains. And then those are the wild rose fruit. So after the flower grows, the petal will die, and then the fruit will come out. And so we kind of use the plant in both stages of its life. A cool thing about New Mexico, we live in such a dehydrator, really. Like, there's pretty low humidity, I think the lowest in the whole country. So the only practice I've ever been able to find of preserving food really is just using the sunlight. There's no packing it in salt or in vinegar like other places. And so in our food, we try and kind of practice that same sort of ethos. And it's the practical thing. We have the sun, and the sun keeps the energy in the food. So we'll pick a lot of these rose fruit and dry them in the sun, and we make a dish with them that has wild elk or deer with an oil made of the rose fruit, and then sourdough cracker, and then a paste of red cap bolete mushrooms, which are the endemic porcini. And it's a small little 2-bite thing, but all those things are super energetic, and when people take that first bite, they kind of usually yell out because it's so so energetic. And we recently got a deer, and we'll eat that deer, and you can feel like the energy in your mouth, and then we go to bed and wake up at like 5 a.m., whether we like it or not. And then we'll eat like grass-fed beef, and it's like, it feels really good too, but the energy of like a wild animal and what it's been eating is so special, and love to serve it with other wild stuff like the rose. Another cornerstone of the project is the clay practice. Taos Pueblo has sort of it's known for having ceramic vessels that are unornate. So if you went to Zuni Pueblo or Hopi, they might have really fancy drawings or really fancy designs. At Taos Pueblo, it's micaceous clay that grows in the mountains there, or not grows, but is found in the mountains there. And it's such a beautiful clay on its own that they don't do any designs on it. It's just the clay itself, mostly used for cooking or for ceremonies. And so when I started to take lessons in ceramics, I didn't really put the pieces together. I didn't think I was going to come home and like dig my ancestral clay and make vessels for my own dinners. I kind of just wanted to learn how to make vessels. But when I decided to move back home, I was like, no duh, that's like the only clay that I can use. So I started digging the clay from the same sort of location in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that my ancestors would dig from, and kind of over the years formulated my own sort of practice with this clay. And so everything from start to finish is hand done. We dig the clay every spring. Once the snow melt's gone, at the Pueblo they talk about Mother Earth in winter as she's sleeping, and you like really don't want to mess with her. And then when spring comes, she's awake, and you can be gentle with her that time. And so we do that in the spring after the snow's melted and the ground's nice and thawed out. We harvest that, process it, and save it throughout the year. Then I'll get back to it in the winter. So it has almost a year of aging on it. After processing the clay, I'll build the pieces, and then we'll sand them with sandstone. So the hills next to us where we're at now are all old sandstone or limestone, and so we'll get the sandstone and we'll be able to sand the vessels with that. I'll burnish the clay with a river stone, which kind of turns the fine clay particles into a tighter mass, so it's more food safe and can hold water longer and just has a really nice feel to it. I'll fire them in a pit, like in the photo here, with red cedar, which is a wood that grows in the mountains near us that we go and collect every year for cooking, for the vessels, for heating our house, for all the things. And once it's fired, we'll cure it with elk marrow and beeswax. The clay itself is made mostly of rose quartz, pink feldspar, sandstone, and mica. If you're unfamiliar with clay and like how it's actually made, it's made from centuries of the earth kind of moving and doing stuff, and all the minerals and rocks and soil and plants and everything kind of decomposing into each other. And so when you're making ceramics, really what you're doing is taking rock that's decomposed over centuries and forming it back into a rock, which is really beautiful. And this clay in particular doesn't vitrify, which means turning to glass. So like porcelain, for instance, turns to glass, and that's why it's such a hard feel to it. But if you drop that or throw it in a fire, it'll break pretty easy. This clay not being vitrified, it's kind of like an adobe where air can circulate in and out of it. It's not like totally such a tight bond. So when you cook in micaceous clay, you can put it straight on embers and it won't break. But because it has that sort of ventilation, the fire and the smoke and all that energy like goes into the clay and into the food and circulates out of it. So when you cook out of clay, this micaceous clay, and especially over fire, it tastes like way better than anything else you've ever had. So we cook in clay vessels, but then we also serve all our food on the same clay. But it's one of those practices that really has like a beautiful connection to the seasons for us, and I only get to work on them during the winter. So when I get to, I'm really excited. Having so many practices also is nice because I like to do a lot of things, and if I did ceramics all year long, I'd be pretty bored. So on the right is one of my bean pots that I made. That one, the blackness of that is kind of what I'm always trying to achieve. And that comes from a little bit of the clay itself, but also the carbon from the fire soaking into the clay. So as the clay is getting heated up, it's soaking in carbon. As oxygen hits the clay, it releases carbon. And so the more that I can trap that carbon in the clay, the happier I am. And so I do that with, this is the red mountain cedar I was talking about. And that's what the Pueblo and Taos traditionally uses. So that's kind of just what I started with and I'll probably use forever. But it burns really hot and fast. And I cut them into these little palitos, we call them in Spanish. And I kind of stack them on top of the vessels so that there's no air that can get inside. And then as soon as the fire is done, I pull them right out while they're still black. If I were to leave them in the fire where the ashes fall off the pot, so like on the bean pot on the side, they'd probably fall off. And so the only black marks would be on the inside where it's concave and can hold the ashes. So I've kind of developed this method of my own to make these black pieces in the fire. You know, there's famous ceramicists like Maria Martinez, or Ortiz, Martinez, who does like black on black stuff. She'll have like matte color and then like a very glossy color on top of each other, and it's really beautiful. But you know, she'd fire it and then put it into an enclosed container with, you know, cow dung or something, and that way it's like fully black. And sometimes I think about doing it that way, but doing it in the fire, it kind of has a mind of its own. So sometimes it's perfectly black, sometimes it's mostly black with a little bit of the natural color coming out, and sometimes it's mostly the natural color. And so I'm trying to be open to letting it do its thing, and it's always more beautiful for it. So generating culture and education, this is sort of like a newer sort of leg of the shed ecosystem. You know, we mostly do all this for selfish reasons. We really enjoy being with the animals and on the land, and we get so much out of it. But it's amazing, like I was saying earlier, when you gather people around a table to share food and stories, how much comes out of that. And a lot of that is, you know, education to the people eating, what the foods that we're serving are, or what this culture is. And so that just happens naturally through the dinners, but we're working on certain platforms on our website to kind of have a little bit more of those sharings. Some nice pictures of our farm. You think of New Mexico and you don't think of like the mountains and beautiful lush pastures like that, but we found the spot. So Parciantes for our system is kind of a way to connect that sort of like generating the education and sharing with people. Our life is pretty secluded. We live on the farm, just the two of us. Sometimes we have help, but most of the time it's just us doing everything. And so we get emails from people or people who come to dinners who are like, please, like, I just want to come help you do anything. Like, we'll mud plaster the house with you, we'll move sheep manure, whatever it is. But it's kind of hard to like provide that for everyone and then take the time to do that. So one of the things we really wanted to do was create a system where we can share maybe all of that or any of that with the largest number of people, and kind of thinking back to like the races and the ceremony part. The more people you can reach with something, the more impact it has in a way. And so the dinners are pretty small and secluded and intimate, but we wanted to create a system that was kind of infinite in that. And so we came up with a system called Parciantes, which is essentially members who become part of our community, like the acequia system that I was mentioning. And so kind of like a membership for anything, like if you think of Patreon or Substack or some of those things where there's a small monthly payment, and then in turn there's specific rewards. So I'll go into some of those here. One of those is the Mercado. So we don't make a lot of work really for outside the dinners ourselves. Maida, my partner, has a beautiful project where she has different Native American artists from New Mexico and different practices. So there's a silversmith, a weaver, I'm a ceramicist, and many others. And so she sells her stuff and some of my stuff, but a lot of the stuff for Shed is kind of stuff that came off the farm or came from our hens directly. And so we don't make a lot of that, and that comes, or becomes available to Parcientas through our website in the Mercado. But actually the most exciting part of the membership is Recuerdos, or remembering. And this is something that I had been wanting to do for a long time, and Maida and I came to a really amazing understanding of what that was. And so it's a collection of remembering, whether it's words or photos or videos, recipes. In the future, we're gonna, probably do some sort of like sit-down conversations with elders and viejos and special people in our area, and tell these stories that are likely to be lost. So that's the house that we're fixing up to be, to share our dinners in, and that's in the pasture where all the cows graze, and our house is just to the right of that, and so is the mercantile. And then the picture on the right is the old mercantile with a root cellar underneath it, which we're not sure what will come of that, but at some point it'll probably be our production space where we'll make our cider and do our ceramics and have a showroom or maybe a small cafe. I think I'm going to read this one. What had started as a project solely based on making dinners has become so much more than just that. While dinners still are the main focus, we put as much attention into everything else that we do, each thing lending itself to the larger ecosystem. Through food, we have learned about ourselves, about community, about health, about dedication and intention. And I'm so honored to have been up here tonight to share with you all a little bit about what we do and why we do it. We feel endlessly fortunate we get to have the lifestyle that we have, one that is based in more than just cooking, a daily practice to anchor us to our terrain and our culture, which blossoms through food. So thank you all for being here. I hope I didn't ramble on for too long. Thank you, guys. Thanks. I think, are we doing a questions and answers? Is that, yeah. Yeah, does anyone have any questions?
My name's Ronald Hartley. I don't have a question, but I wanted to let you know that my wife and I were in Taos 2 weeks ago.
Oh, nice.
And we went to visit that hacienda.
Oh, awesome.
And we discovered your project while we were there.
No way.
And I bought a book from that gentleman that was selling his books in the room next to you guys.
Oh, sweet.
And he told us all about you, so we were excited when we saw this being advertised here in Silver to come check you out. So we couldn't come participate in the dinner because we were only there for a couple days and we had our 2-year-old with us. But when we discovered you here, we took turns. So I'm here to learn about you tonight.
Oh, nice.
And she'll be there tomorrow at the Commons. So
Well, thank you so much. That means so much.
What you're doing is amazing and it's beautiful, and I'm trying to just respect and appreciate it and not be envious.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Oh. Yeah, it's something that kind of has been like a step here and a step there, and my mom kind of always taught me that like in my life that if I just like took the right steps and trusted in my intentions that I would end up where I needed to go. And it's cool when you watch yourself not knowing where you're going, but just like putting the steps in the right directions. Like it gets you there at some point, and you can't really know where that is, but you always get there. So yeah. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, thank you all for being here.